Okay, so I think it's recording now. This is the little workshop on feminism, and I think we're ready to start. So first, the structure of today's workshop, I'm going to start talking about how feminism is important in debate world, so to speak. Then we're going to cover some basic aspects like the different waves of feminism, how it developed, the difference between gender and sex, some currently very used mechanisms by the feminist movement, and then we're going to get into some topic areas and talk about feminism in politics, feminism in war, sex and rape, and ecofeminism. Okay, so feminism in debate. So two reasons why feminism is important in the debate world. First of all, there are a lot of motions directly tackling the issue of feminism, right? So whether the feminist movement should do certain things, approve of certain discourses, rhetorics, goals, etc. But then secondly, there are also a lot of motions that do not focus on the issue of feminism, but during which the feminist cause can be mentioned because women become a very relevant stakeholder in those kinds of debates. So, for example, if you have a motion about a welfare state, like maybe if you should up the taxes and have a more encompassing welfare state, then women are a stakeholder you might want to raise because and you have a welfare state that, for example, provides amazing childcare policies, then women have an easier time entering the job market and going to work and being less financially dependent on, for example, an abusive husband and get out of negative situations like that easier. And that's just how women are impacted by, for example, more or a more encompassing welfare state. Or another example from recent politics is the current TB debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, right? So they talked about the potential reform of the Affordable Care Act. So if Trump would be reelected and reform the Affordable Care Act, then, for example, pregnancies could or would be viewed as something like pre-existing conditions, and that would up the cost for the same treatment that men have just because a woman is pregnant, and it would be seen as a pre-existing condition. So that would severely disadvantage women as well, right? So what we can kind of see here is that women as a stakeholder often are disproportionately disadvantaged or hit most severely by disadvantages. So what I would recommend you guys do before every debate or during a debate is think about who is impacted, if women could be a stakeholder that are impacted, and if so, how. And we're going to hopefully make it a little bit easier for you during the next couple of minutes or maybe hour, during which I'll talk about feminism, because now we're going to cover the basics and kind of what I'm aiming to do here is give you the tools you need to argue in the name of feminism convincingly, right? So the first aspect of the basic section, so to speak, is the development of the feminist movement. And as we probably all know, is that the feminist movement has developed in three waves. So the first one is kind of started around the 1800s and went on until 1920s, and was a little bit or is often referred to as the liberal feminist movement, and it had ties to Marxism. So this feminist movement tried to engage women in the public sphere, right? So they wanted women to be able to work and to vote and be seen in the public sphere. So, for example, the issue of the feminization of the workforce was one of the issues tackled by that kind of feminist movement. So, economic liberation and voting, and the focus was of the public sphere. The second wave of the feminist movement can be said to be kind of from the 1960s to the 1980s, and it's often referred to as the radical feminist movement. But radical not in the like maybe direct understanding of the term that it is radical as such, but radical because it places the issue of like the patriarchy, the issue at core is sexuality, right? So they talked, or like the issues that movement tackled was a lot of like the reproduction issues. So you probably have heard of the like 68 demonstrations, 1968. And for those of you that are from Germany, you probably know the very famous cover of the magazine Stern, where all of the women that have had publicly admitted to having an abortion, even though it was illegal. So those were the kind of issues tackled: reproductive rights, sexuality. And basically what you can see is that it moved from the public sphere, from the first wave, more towards the private sphere, right? Sexuality, reproduction, etc. The third feminist movement wave, so to speak, is from the 1990s and reaches into the 2000s, and it is super diverse. So it's post-structural, post-colonial, queer feminism, Black feminism, ecofeminism, etc. And it's focuses a lot on identity and intersectionality, right? So it asks questions like, what is agency? Who is a feminist subject? And it focuses on the power asymmetries in the world right now, right? So maybe the North-South divide, aspects like racism, etc. So this is probably also the kind of wave of feminism you're going to want to argue with in a debate. Intersectionality is key here, so I'll just repeat the definition real quick so you're not going to get it wrong. So intersectionality basically means that it considers various categories of differentiation. So for example, racism, sexual orientation, yeah, like if you're poor, economic circumstances. So it considers all of those aspects and looks at them in particular historical context, right? So instead of arguing, or like if instead of asking yourself in preparation for a debate, like, are women impacted? You might want to ask yourself, which women are impacted? Because as it focuses a lot on identity, you also have to understand that the experiences of me identifying as a woman, I'm a cis woman, I'm heterosexual, I'm white, and I'm living in a liberal country. So my daily experience as a woman might vary greatly from someone who lives under an oppressive regime, is not heterosexual, is maybe a person of color. So our daily experiences, even though we're both women, might vary greatly from each other. So that's why the intersectional approach is so insanely important. So which women are impacted is the question you want to keep in mind for like debate prep, right? This wave, like the third wave of the feminist movement, is more equalitarian as well, right? So it's concerned with human rights in general, with the environment. And it is important to know and maybe also state in the debate that the end goal of this feminist movement is equality, like no ideas of revenge or whatever. But if you state, for example, that the end goal is equality, you also have to explain and understand the term power. So if you view power as such, for example, in a zero-sum term, meaning that there's only a limited amount of power, currently men hold more power than women. In order to make it equal, you have to take some power away from men. Then this might imply that you're going to argue for different strategies or mechanisms in which you will try for the women to, or for women to regain power to become equal, compared to an understanding of power that views like that there is a possibility to just uplift women to the level of power men currently hold without taking some power away from men, right? Okay, before I move on, let me just check the chat real quick because there have been a couple of messages. Okay, perfect. So I think we can just resume if there are no questions up to this point. Are there any questions? No? Okay, great. Then let's continue. So when we're talking about the basics of feminism, one thing we also want to look at, for example, is the enemy of feminism, and which that would be patriarchy, right? So patriarchy is a system of social hierarchical of a social like hierarchy, and it values traditionally masculine characteristics. Oh, 1 second, there was something in the chat. Someone asked me, you told us the definition of something. What was the term? My internet connection is poor, sorry. No problem. Either you meant patriarchy, which I'm talking about right now, or intersectionality, which was looking at different points of distinction and how different forms of oppression interplay together. Okay, perfect. So we can resume with like the patriarchy point. So patriarchy is understood as a system of like social hierarchy that values traditionally male characteristics more than traditionally female characteristics on an aggregated level. That means that men are superior to women, right? This is like what feminist movements fight against, and it's pretty tricky because the patriarchy is not like maybe a couple of years ago where women were not allowed to vote or something. It was also in the like, I don't know, maybe rules of thumb, subconscious, all of the underlying things that you cannot tackle directly. So most countries still have, or like a couple of countries, especially Western countries, have outlawed sexism, right? So they say men and women are supposed to be treated equal. However, it's not full equality that is reached yet, right? So that's a little bit hard in fighting patriarchy. It's not something like obvious you can see all of the time. The third how do you say differentiation that we have to make is the differentiation between gender and sex. I think that's going to be fairly important when arguing the feminist cause. So gender can be understood as being the construction of sex, but then also masking that sex itself is societally constructed, right? So what many scholars look at instead is gender performativity, meaning like what we do in a regulated context of normative heterosexuality. So that would mean that gender is not what we are, but also what we do. So for example, it would mean that societally becoming a woman means that you identify with femininity and things associated with it, and that you desire the masculine. So that means that it's always an interplay and it's interactive between masculinity and femininity, and that it's constantly reproduced by the way we conduct ourselves in the daily, right? Also, we acknowledge at this point the constitutive rule of language in creating gendered knowledge. So, for example, that you refer to women as victims in need of saving, which we're going to get back to later in the field study, basically, of politics. But what is going to be probably important to understand when arguing with sex and gender or differentiating between the two of them is on a like a little bit more basic level, which maybe is a little bit easier to understand, is that sex as a term refers to the biology. So for example, men having higher level of testosterone and everything like that, and gender is referring to the social construct around it as well. So for example, that boys would like blue and girls would prefer pink, like also from a young age. And then something to note here is the point of nature versus nurture. So for example, no baby probably is born with a very strong preference for pink or blue, but it's nurtured, right? So the way we raise our kids. And it doesn't stop with the colors. So for example, girls are more often given dolls to play with and to take care of, and play kitchens to cook in, and boys are more associated with playing outside, playing football, etc., right? So I'm not just caring about toys people play with so much, but it actually translates into things that are associated with women as they are grown up as well, right? So women are often said, for example, to be more empathetic and more caring than boys. But I don't think that any baby girl is born with more empathy just based on it, like the baby being female. biologically. However, it's like the nurture point here, so that from a very young age on, you're given dolls to take care of, to care for, and then you're pushed into more caring jobs, or where caring is more important, like for example being a nurse or being a teacher. That means that those qualities that are seen to be natural with women, which are for example maybe empathy or being more caring, this is not nature, it's nurture, right? So those qualities can develop more, and they're encouraged to develop differently with girls versus with boys. And this becomes important, for example, in debate as with, for example, like parental leave motions, where it is said that women should have more time off of work because they're naturally more caring and the babies needed more something, then you can say that this would just be nurture and not nature, and that fathers should be given the same chance to develop the same level of empathy or care or whatever than women, because they can, it's just not as encouraged in the society. And those are the things that I meant earlier of patriarchy being more subtle, right? It's not a very direct opponent you can see, but it's those like subtle ways that cause men and women to be treated differently and be socialized into roles very differently. Okay. And one more general thing to clarify is the fourth point, which is mechanisms feminist movements use fairly commonly. The first one is probably to raise awareness, right, through methods like shaming and naming. So, for example, calling out a company that has sexist policies, or, for example, does not give motherhood leave, or has strong glass ceilings or something, right? So call out that company, increase public pressure by increasing public awareness, and hope that the company is going to change its sexist policy. That's just an example of this mechanism, can be applied to most things. And the second mechanism, for example, would be to change the societal perception of gender. So for example, to explain that girls are not naturally more caring, but it's nurture. Exactly. So that would be it to the basics. Are there any questions in that regard? You can either write in the chat or just start talking if you have a question.
Sorry, could you please let us remember the meaning of the gender, since I didn't grasp the real meaning of what you said.
Oh, okay, sure. So the
Thank you.
difference between gender and sex is basically that sex refers to all of the biological things like levels of testosterone or like the organs you can see and everything like that. And gender refers to the social construct that is associated with the sex, right? So, for example, that women are more caring, or aspects of femininity, those kind of things. So everything that is not biologically proven or cannot be biologically proven, but still is associated with being a man or being a woman. Does that make sense?
Yes, sure. Thank you.
No problem. Any other questions? No, okay, great. So we can proceed. What we're going to do now is kind of focus on different motions or topic areas. So we're going to talk about domestic and international politics, focusing on political representation, war, then the issue of like sex and rape, and then what happens when feminist values clash with other minority rights, for example, or like other values, and then lastly ecofeminism. And probably in between, I'm going to ask you if you guys want to have a little break. So yeah. Let's get started on politics. The first thing I wanted to talk about here is the aspect of representation. So there's still mainly or predominantly or a majority of white men in national level parliaments, right? And this cannot be explained by women being less interested in politics, for example, because women are interested in politics and they are active, which can be seen on the sub-national levels, right? So movements, engagement in non-governmental organizations, grassroots level politics, all those things. Women are very active there. So you cannot say that women are simply not interested in politics. So how do you explain then that, for example, in both of the houses, like upper and lower house, like Senate and Congress, for example, there are 24% women only globally as an average, or in Europe, it's 29% if you don't count the Scandinavian countries, because Scandinavia is pretty advanced. We have 44% of women, which is still not completely fair, not 50%, but it's better than the rest of the world, basically, right? So how do you explain that difference, even though we just established that women are just as interested in politics? So this is probably patriarchy, but why it is so harmful and so detrimental is because there's a difference between substantial and substantive and social representation. And I'm going to get into why it is important to have more women in parliament this way, right? So substantive representation basically means being represented based on the opinions you have, on the ideas you have, and which policies you would prefer, for example. So that can be seen by, for example, which party you vote for. It is, for example, whether you would prefer more taxes being spent on infrastructure, like all of those things, right? The opinions you have. However, social representation means being represented by someone you can identify with. So either it's another woman or it's maybe another person of color. So basically being represented by someone that is similar to you, that you feel represented by. And that is very important because not only does it increase the legitimacy of politics, because it makes people feel more represented, but also some issues cannot be planned for, right? So no one knew that coronavirus was going to hit 2020, and you could not prepare for that, and you could not vote on an opinion of how it should be handled because you didn't know it. So the best strategy there is to vote for someone you trust, you feel is similar to you, and you feel will advance your interests. Not everything can be expected. Additionally, probably you guys all are familiar with all of the memes on Instagram, for example, with all of the white men talking about abortion and reproductive rights. And it's obviously very, very hilarious because men biologically cannot give birth, and it's not an experience they are biologically able to have. So this is why it's important to have a woman in parliament who maybe can understand it better based on her own experiences, or politics of like sexual harassment or something. You might want another woman in parliament because she understands it on a different level than a man based on the experiences you have. And this is kind of tying back to the identity idea in the third wave of feminism. Yeah, so that's the course of analysis many people use here. And this mechanism can obviously not only be used with politics, but for example, also with economics. So for example, why you should have more women on the very high level of politics, in the like more female bosses, and not politics, excuse me, on companies, right? So I should have more female bosses, or like women up in the very high influential positions in companies, because they can identify the obstacles they face on their way up. They can break down the glass ceilings from top down, etc. We have another question in the chat. 1 second. Why can you only be represented by people that share one specific group identity with you? Okay, that's not what I meant. Maybe I was not clear enough. You cannot, that's like the aspect of social representation, right? So substantive would be based on opinion and social would be based on characteristics. So basically what I explained earlier about understanding different issues differently, meaning that social representation would also boost the level or advance the level of substantive representation, but also because if you feel belonging or like feel represented in politics, it advances the entire legitimacy of politics. So it has those kind of benefits, but also some policies cannot be or some events cannot be expected to happen. So for example, the COVID thing, you could not vote based on someone who you think handles it the way you would handle it. You can't do that because you don't know what's going to happen. So you need someone you trust that will advance your interests and can identify with you. Does that answer the question, Ari? Ari? Is that a sufficient answer for you? Okay.
Yeah, it is. I also wrote you.
Oh, okay. Sorry, it just came. Thank you. So that on representation. Now we're going to continue with security. So security is often viewed in terms of national security or state security only, right? So that would, for example, be a definition that excludes men's violence against women. In fact, most attempts made by the state to advance national or state security and decrease women's security, and we're going to go back to that later. So what we need instead of like the national state security is, for example, a more encompassing definition of security. So it should be physical, economic, social, no structural or cultural oppression, etc. So that's the definition of security we need. There's a new one by the UN, which includes security in terms of having food, having housing, feeling socially secure, not having to deal with structural or indirect forms of violence. So that's the kind of security we need. But I just said that national security or state security often makes women less secure, and I've not explained it yet, but that's what I'm going to get into now. So war very often is understood as a business between men, right? So because mainly men fight, etc. However, women are very much at the center of war, and it's definitely not just a business between men. First of all, we can notice maybe that women very often are used as legitimization or for war and put in a victimized position. So in order for that to make sense, we have to understand that the wars we see right now, most of them are a democracy waging war against a non-democracy, right? So that's statistically the most common type of war we have between states. Then we also have to understand the concept of logic of appropriateness versus logic of consequence. So for example, a democracy would like to gain oil or access to economic resources of another country. However, they cannot just wage war against the other country because it would go against the logic of appropriateness and would result in severe backlash from the international community because we have those norms of sovereignty and non-interference. So you need to have a reason for going to war. And very often that reason is to save the women and children, right? So women are very often used as an excuse to go to war as a legitimization for going to war. And that is problematic on a couple of levels. First of all, it very often involves this like racist dimension, right? Because very often those countries, that democracies send soldiers to save brown women from brown men. So, and the saviors are white men. So that in itself is inherently racist. It goes against the norms of sovereignty, and it's very often like just an excuse to go to war, as we can see. One second. Yeah, so having referred to earlier to the concept of gender and sex, right? We talked, or like I just mentioned very briefly, that language itself is a powerful tool. And this discourse of going to war to save women and children, just having those rhetorics is very harmful as well, because it keeps putting women in the position of victims and in need for saviors. So it views them passively and basically powerless. Another thing we can talk about when we talk about women in war is that women and men experience war very, very differently. So first of all, and very often there's like made a legal difference even, right? So for example, if a woman is raped during war, it's considered a crime against humanity. If a man is raped in a war, it's considered torture according to the definitions or the law of the International Criminal Court. So we can see that there's a legal difference made, but there are a couple of more differences. So for example, women are active differently. As I explained earlier, women are often put into this like passive subordinate position of needing saving, right? But that's not true. Women are very active in war, but maybe just not fighting in the front lines of battle. So more soldiers are male, we all know that, but women are still very active. They cook for all of those soldiers. They are nurses taking care of them. They have to rebuild the country after war very often. They're often used as spies, etc. So we can see that women are active in war, just maybe not in the narrow definition that it is in our minds. Secondly, women experience different negative consequences of war than men do. So if you are a man, you're 3 times as likely as a woman to die just being a civilian. However, as a woman, you're 3 times as likely to experience oppression based on your sex, right? And those are statistics from one of my professors at uni. So she did research on that actually. So that means that we cannot just like view war as business between men, because women are impacted by it and they are impacted differently. So we need more gender sensitive analysis in that specific context. Also, rape is often used as a tool of war, as a strategic tool of war, and those that suffer are women, right? So if we look, for example, at the cases of Bosnia or even the war in Rwanda, it, there was an ethnic dimension involved in these wars, and it resulted in a massive amount of women being raped, because the discourse was that the child a woman would give birth to only would have the ethnicity of the father, not of the mother, right? So we see again how powerful language is and understanding of certain things, so the discourse, but also this was a negative impact of that war that mainly focused on women, right? Because they were the ones being raped. However, it is curious to understand that it was seen as an insult to the fatherland or the fathers or brothers of those women, and analysis or like even studies done of those situations did not focus so much on the women that experienced that kind of trauma. So we can see that women often are used as legitimization to go to war, but the impacts on the women are often neglected, not only in analysis, but also in politics. Furthermore, in the status quo, more and more women are like involved in the military, for example, in the name of equality. So, for example, the US military had big campaigns on involving more women in the name of equality. However, those obstacles that come with trying to involve women in situations that are structured predominantly according to like men, those obstacles and overcoming those obstacles, that is something which women have to do. So for example, in the US military, when more women joined, there were no separate shower facilities given for women, and when women complained about being uncomfortable and with showering in a room full of men, then they were told to just get bigger towels. And this is kind of the perfect example. You want more gender equality, you want to include more women, but all of the obstacles that come with it, due to those existing structures being mainly focused on only having men, those structures or the obstacles that come with that are put on the women to like overcome. Right, so do we have more questions? 1 second. When it comes to abortion, men like women split into liberal and conservative ones. What exactly is the benefit of having the decision made by women? Do you have a specific example? Yeah, so this is about the representation again, right? The representation I mentioned earlier politically, that you need to have substantive and social representation. So we have to see that even if you would have like a lot of women in parliament, there still might be women that are conservative and there still are women that are more liberal, right? But that involves the substantive dimension, um, if you would allow abortion or not, or under which circumstances, etc. And also some women in politics do not see themselves as representing all women, right? So not every female politician actively would come out and say, I am feminism, I am advancing the feminist cause. So there's no actual guarantee that having more women in politics would certainly abolish patriarchal traces that are left in society. However, I think just so you can vote for a man that is against or for abortion, and you can vote for a woman that is against or for abortion, right? So that doesn't make a difference. However, I feel like or like the analysis is that having more women in politics, so having more social representation, would make a difference in the terms that they would actually have a different level of understanding of what it means to maybe undergo that, what it means to be a woman, what it means to be able to give birth, what it means that all of the responsibility in preventing a pregnancy is put on the women in terms of women have to take pills every day, etc. So maybe that would make a difference, and it probably would result in most voters feeling better represented, just because someone represents them having had the same experiences. I hope this was a somewhat satisfying answer. It's very tricky because there's no actual proof that everything would be liberal and there would be no patriarchy left in society if there were more female politicians. But certainly people would feel more represented, and it kind of makes sense to have more women talk about those issues instead of like a parliament filled with men that certainly make decisions about women's bodies, right? Okay, great. So what do you guys think? Do you want to keep going or maybe take a 5-minute break before we resume with the next topic area, which is sex and rape? Ari says keep going. Are there any other opinions? Does anybody need a break? No, okay. So we're going to keep going. Great. So I've already mentioned about social substantive representation, women in war, etc., and those negotiations. And before we move to addressing the issue of like sex and rape specifically out of the war context, we can kind of analyze a little bit the need for more women in high-level politics. And that is actually research done by one of my professors at uni, and I think it's super convincing. So even if there might be some doubts if substantively like issues or something on abortion, for example, would change if you would have more women in parliament, I think those like 3 things she found out are super convincing. It is about international politics, so for example negotiations between 2 countries. So she found out that the likelihood of agreements being reached in the first place between 2 countries in negotiations is more like higher if women are just present in the room, that the peace negotiations are therefore more successful because an agreement is being reached, but also in those documents that then often very much build the foundation of having the new country, rebuilding the new country after, for example, war having taken place. Those documents involve more gender sensitive language and then are first of all more likely to abolish issues of sexism or like sexual oppression in the rebuilding of the country because they're more gender sensitive, and the peace is more long lasting and more stable in those countries usually. And lastly, if women are just members of those troops, like of those military troops that go abroad in the name of, for example, spreading democracy or saving women or whatever excuse there is to go to war, and the troops behave more peacefully, less aggressively against locals and crimes of war, like, I don't know, stealing, rape, etc. Like those crimes from soldiers being sent in are less likely as well if women are just members of the troop. Someone put into the group chat, talking about history and literature, we normally find more male personalities who are nowadays praised and remembered. Therefore, as an example, you think that if an author like Shakespeare had been a woman, he would have experienced the same literary career and remarkable success. Okay, this is kind of like, can we keep those kind of questions to the end that are not very urgent with understanding what I'm talking about right now? Because I think it kind of interrupts the flow. I should have said it earlier, I apologize. But I will just answer this question very briefly. I think in history, the feminist cause and the fight of feminists was not as advanced as it is today. So from that term on, we're kind of privileged. So I think if we look at a lot of like female, very, very talented women in the past, so for example, the wife of Albert Einstein, or Clara Schumann, the sister of the very famous composer and pianist, all of those had to share their discoveries, scientific discoveries, or their works of art, like their compositions, etc., and they were then published by their brothers just because they had a different standing and reached a different level of acknowledgement if they were published by a male character compared to a female character, right? So Clara Schumann did publish, for example, some of her musical compositions by her own, but they were not nearly as successful as the ones that were later found out are hers but published by her brother. So I think given, due to those like patriarchal structures that are very, or were even more dominant than they are today in the past, I don't think that they would have reached the same level of success. Friends in the waiting room. Yes, I can let them in 1 second. I don't see anyone in the waiting room. Yeah, I can't see that there's anyone in the waiting room, unfortunately. Yeah. No, I can't see anyone being in the waiting room. I'm sorry. Let me send a message real quick to the organizers to let people into the breakout room. 1 second. So you can think of more questions you have. I'll send a message and try to fix it real quick. Okay, great. Perfect. So yeah, I think that was it on politics, why we need women in politics and of the obstacles women face currently. Now we're going to, having already mentioned like rape as a tool of war, right? We're going to take that out of that context for a little bit and talk about it, how courts currently deal with it, etc., right? So in most Western courts, whether something is ruled or like is ruled as sex or as rape is judged based on the mens rea of the perpetrator. So basically of the understanding of the perpetrator, whether they did something wrong and whether they actually caused harm to the woman or not, right? So whether they were aware they were actively raping someone. This is a very insufficient definition. We're going to talk about it why in a second. But before we do that, I just want to mention that it is very, very hard to actually find a good definition on how to differentiate sex from rape. Because, for example, there were attempts trying to define rape as abuse, but that doesn't make sense because abuse cannot be consented to at all, or remains abuse even if it is consented to. And that's kind of the crucial difference between sex and rape, right? So it's very hard to find a definition, but the one that's currently used is insufficient, and we're going to talk about why in a bit. But before we do it, it's important to note that with this understanding, with this definition of looking for the mens rea, the burden of proof also lays with the woman. So she has to prove that harm was done to her. And usually this proof consists of physical violence, like maybe marks, etc., like physical evidence or evidence of physical violence, right? So now a couple of layers of why this is insufficient. First, because there in general is a power asymmetry when it comes to sex, right? So very often we have in society this custom of the male approach, whether it is in a bar, in a club, in a cafe, in movies, in any different daily situation you can think of. It's basically always or most often the man approaching the woman and expressing some kind of interest. So this is inherently unequal to the woman's ability to consent or not consent, because the woman's ability to consent or not is reactive, and the man's ability, or like the custom of the male initiative, is the active part, right? So it's inherently asymmetrical, which is why you cannot say that like only if there's physical violence then it's sex. So this is like the first, then it's rape. So this is the first argument or layer of analysis of why the current definition is not enough. Because there is this power asymmetry, and this is the second layer, there is fear of being raped with women, and this fear is very real. You can see it by women walking home at night with like the keys between their fingers to be able to defend themselves, women calling an Uber even if it's more expensive and there actually are trains going, just because you're afraid of something happening to you. So this fear of rape is very real. And this fear is also kind of enabling rape, because if someone approaches you, or like if a man approaches a woman, then very often, or like not very often, but in some scenarios, women might consent even though they actually do not want to have sex, just because they're afraid of being raped in the way that is usually portrayed in movies, or like the definition that is insufficient, someone raping you with force, someone like a stranger in a dark alley in a creepy raincoat or something, right? So you might consent to something because you are afraid of something even worse happening to you, which is why looking for signs of physical force is insufficient, right? So it means even if there are no signs of force or physical violence, it does not mean that the woman was in control. This strategy is like often called like submit to survive. So women consent to something they don't actually want to consent to because they are afraid of something worse happening to them. And another thing that is very, or like why this definition as it's used currently is not sufficient, is that it rests on the subconscious, or like that it rests on the subjective experience of the man that was in that situation, that however can be influenced. So for example, pornography kind of influences it subconsciously, because in pornography sex is always portrayed as having one active and one passive part, and women are often very passive, or there are those like yeah, I don't want to get into it, but this like influences the way women men develop their understanding of what is sex and what is rape and what is normal and what is not normal, right? So even if a woman, for example, says no, then it's most often to be understood as a no for a specific sexual practice and not the entire thing, or the removal of consent, which should be something very normal and very accepted, suddenly something strange and abnormal just because of the way those movies portray it. And the influence of that is so big because it's now accessible for free basically to any hour of the day, because it's online now. A lot of people consume it. It's very easy to access this even if you're underage. So things have changed in that regard. So the subconscious influence is very big. So that is why the definition as it is viewed in courts is insufficient. Another layer why this definition does not work is that women are often viewed relational to men. So for example, as someone's daughter or as someone's wife. So the metric of marriage, for example, is that women submit to one specific man to be safe from all of the other men. However, this, for example, is very, very bad for sex within a marriage, for example, that has only recently been acknowledged as actually a crime. The atrocities that have to be proven in those kind of situations are far greater, but that is the most common kind of rape there is. So, and the damage that it does to women is often more significant than if it was a stranger, because there was this illusion of trust and mutuality before, right? So, this relational view is very harmful in that regard, but also because it completely takes the focus away from like the woman's actual lust or consent, away to who she is in relation to a man. So what we see from that is that women very often are disadvantaged even in the pursuit of justice. If you look at like the intersectional approach in that regard, you might want to mention the fetishization of certain races in pornography, because I've just explained how big the subconscious influence of that is. And you can also say that the feminist movements were right, fighting for the private being public as well, and the private needing to be protected as well. And you can also see that power and sex are relational, right? What I've talked about now kind of rests on the analysis of McKinnon. She's often criticized for having this heterosexual approach to it, right? So also women can rape men, or like there can be rape in homosexual relationships as well. But I've just focused on this as it is the definition as used in court and the majority of the cases. Okay. Any questions in that regard? Did it work out with your friends in the waiting room? Did someone let them in? Okay, perfect. We have two more topic areas to talk about before we can kind of open up the discussion and just chat about different issues or concerns or topic areas you would like to address in the name of feminism. And one of that is what happens when feminism clashes with other rights, for example, minority rights. So how to handle a debate like that. So it is quite common that feminism or like women's liberation rights or women's values or values of the feminist movement clash with other kinds of values. And I'm going to kind of illustrate it by using the example of multiculturalism. So in multiculturalism basically mainly means that you give certain additional rights to minority groups. So to protect their culture from going extinct, for example, right? But most often, what is tried to be defended, or the practices that people try to defend in the name of multiculturalism, are practices harming women. So for example, there's like the practice of hunt and marriage in the Middle East, where literally women are hunted down and then married if captured, or like clitoridectomy, where like the clitoris is removed to keep women virgins until marriage. But the example I'm going to use throughout this is, for example, polygamy in France, right? So polygamy was legal in France during the 1980s. So basically, if you were born in France, you were not allowed to have multiple women, but immigrants were allowed to do so, right? So polygamy was legal for immigrants in the name of multiculturalism. This was really bad because a lot of those additional wives expressed concern and dissatisfaction with it being legal. They said that it is an abusive practice, that it's really, really bad that it's illegal in their home countries they fled from, but it is even more insane that in a liberal Western country, they legalized it as well, even though it is so harmful to those women. And only later, way in, France reacted to those voices of women and then made it illegal again, but without considering what would happen to all of those, for example, financially dependent additional wives of an individual. So this is one example of how minority rights actually hurt women. And if you want to argue why feminism should go above minority rights, I have some ideas for you. So one is, for example, that multiculturalism mainly focuses on issues between a majority group and a minority group. So for example, about French citizens versus immigrants to France, but they neglect the conflicts within those groups. So, for example, men versus women in those groups of immigrants that were coming to France. Another string of argumentation you could use is that women are of those groups are socialized into subordination and especially vulnerable and therefore need to be protected. And this is due to a couple of things. First of all, because all of their role models are living under that practice that is subordinating women. So for example, all of their mothers are multiple wives, all of their sisters and aunts, maybe the women that they pick to as role models, they are in those subordinate positions. So that is what they see as normal. It's especially true because those minority groups tend, not in all cases, but tend to live segregated from the majority group, which makes those practices we see as protecting basic human rights, like, for example, polygamy being illegal, it makes them seem as strange and alien, which can kind of be seen to be analogous with the Rumspringa by the Amers. So we all think that having access to technology is amazing, and maybe drinking alcohol every now and then or going to a club with friends or whatever, having those freedoms we think is something natural and good. But when those teenagers from Amish communities go on the Rumspringa to experience the same things, they see this alien and strange, so they go back to the way it was before. So we can see how being socialized into something influences their understanding of something being normal and being right. This is especially true because fighting for equality in those minority groups, for example, if women stand up for equality, it is often at the cost of their entire social network, because often then you're excluded from that group and you're not allowed to be a part of it anymore, of the a part of the group. So you lose all of the ties to your family, you lose all of the friends you have, etc. So this would be analysis for why you should prioritize women's rights and the feminist cause over minority rights. So you would stress the vulnerability of women, the mechanized oppression that women have to experience in those minority groups. So you have to think, if you prepare for a motion, which specific group of women you're talking about, and the specific concerns they might have, which are outlined by the abusive practices, right? So let me just check the chat real quick. Could you please repeat the insufficient definition? So it's about the sex and rape thing. It was that courts currently view or distinguish between sex and rape based on the mens rea. So it's a lesson term for the understanding of being a perpetrator or a violator. So for example, if one part actively knew that he was currently raping a woman. So that is the definition. And then they do it by looking for signs of physical violence on the woman's body, for example. And what was the argumentation? You said something in regards to women in politics, that they are equally interested. What was the argumentation analysis for that? Okay, so that was earlier when I was talking about the representation, right? That women are equally as interested in politics as men. And what I mentioned in that context is that women are very active in politics on the grassroots level, so subnational levels, that they are very, very engaged in non-governmental organizations, etc. So it means that they have interest, that they are active, but especially on national levels, there must be some obstacles women have a hard time overcoming, given that globally there's an average of 24% of women in national level parliaments only. Does that answer your question? Okay, great. So maybe we can go to the last point now, which is ecofeminism. I just wanted to mention very briefly, and then we can open up a discussion about some feminist concerns. If you think I'm wrong with some things I've said today, if you thought about counter arguments intuitively, if you have different areas you would like to apply feminism to, etc. Right? But before we do that, the last kind of topic area I wanted to talk about in the name of feminism, which is ecofeminism. So it was in the third wave of feminism as well, and basically what happens then is climate change being gendered, right? So you ask questions about who is most vulnerable to climate change, who is most responsible for climate change, or whose actions, and who makes the important decisions in that regard currently. So unfortunately and sadly, it is the case that the richest 1% are responsible for as much pollution as the poorest 50% of the world. Another thing that can be mentioned in this regard is like the land grab. So some feminists say that the male domination of women translates into the human domination of land. So for example, Nestle as a company going into Africa and privatizing water sources and then basically selling the water to those locals that they just like privatize and taken away from them in plastic bottles, right? So land grabs as well, dams being built, those polluting companies. So the richest are responsible for most of the climate change, right? And women are specifically harmed by climate change. Firstly, because if we look at tendencies, if you have to migrate because of climate change, so if you become a climate refugee, mainly men migrate and leave women behind. So women have less ability to move away from all of the issues that are caused by climate change. Climate justice also is tied to social justice, so it has a social justice dimension. And climate denialism can be seen to be tied to certain forms of masculinity, like petromasculinity. So it often is tied to some understanding of being a man if you are an oil producer or coal producer, or drive those big cars, etc. So it has to do something with the identity. So it can be seen to be tied to some form of masculinity. And those that are mainly harmed, for example, in their daily lives, we don't think of are women. So a majority of all of the small scale farmers, so not big corporations, but small scale farmers are women, and they're the ones that suffer and lose their existence because of plagues and because of floods or dry seasons. So those that are responsible are mainly very rich individuals, and those that make the decision based on the lack of women in very high powerful positions are men, and those that are mainly vulnerable to climate change are the poor and women. So ecofeminism is pointing that out and trying to change it as well. Okay, so that would be it from my part. If you have any questions, any issue areas you would like to discuss, or anything else, we can get into that now. Yeah, Leonie raised her hand.
Would you say that Melania Trump is a feminist or seen as a role model because she is so powerful? Or do you see that she's not that powerful, or that she, as she just sticks to her husband, is not a feminist at all?
Okay, so you're talking about the first lady. I'm sorry, I have trouble hearing you. You're talking about the
Yeah,
first lady of the US, right?
yeah,
So whether
Melania
she's
Trump.
a feminist or a US role model, I think that is a very, very difficult individual to judge that based on, and their entire discussion surrounding it. So it's very hard to say like or give a yes or no answer. Yeah, so there are people that are of different opinions. I personally do not think she's a very good feminist role model, but that's just my personal opinion. And I guess you could find a lot of arguments for and against that thesis for both sides. I know that's such an not satisfying answer. Yeah, but that's all I can say. I'm sorry. Yes, Mira, you raised your hand as well.
Hello. Yes, so I just wanted to ask in general about the idea of whether if men can be just allies to feminism or if they can be feminists within themselves, because this is an idea that I've just been learning about and I don't understand properly if, if a man can just be seen as an ally or as a feminist.
Okay, so this has kind of resemblance to white allies with the Black Lives Matter movement, right? So the idea of like allyship is being someone that supports the cause as well, even though not being personally affected by it. So the question is whether men can be active feminists or just allies, basically. In my opinion, feminism, or like the way I understand it, and I think the way this presentation or little talk has been built on as well, is that feminism is just aiming for gender equality, right? So it's not some idea of revenge or anything like that. It's just gender equality, basically, and men and women having the exact same opportunities in life and women not having to deal with additional obstacles. And based on that, I think that men can be feminists. And I think it has to do a lot with being aware of their own privilege. So being aware that you're privileged in certain situations based on being a man, actively fighting for the cause of gender equality, etc. But yeah, I think that men can be feminists. Yes, someone else raised their hand, but I don't see the name.
Yeah. It's a bit of a loaded question, but why do you think patriarchy like exists? I'm a new debater, so maybe I don't.
Yeah, that is a big question. Um, I don't know, I guess. I think maybe it has something to do with like back in the like Stone Age, men were the providers, right? So it was a lot based on physical ability, and physically men are stronger than women. So it kind of put women in a position of dependency just based on that, right? Because they're physically not as strong as men, which is a biological fact. But then with technologization and everything, it doesn't matter so much anymore. But I guess the structures of men being dominant kind of remained, and then there are a lot of arguments that are found to, I don't know, support it, right? So in the Bible it was Eve that grabbed the apple, etc. So there also in culture women are put in the subordinate position. So I guess maybe that is part of why it exists, but I don't know the entire answer to that. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's all right. I'm sorry.
No,
Thank you.
no problem. I hope it was somewhat of at least touching the question you asked. Yeah, someone else raised their hand. Art.
Hi. So, do you believe that like the feminist movement should focus on like shifting its narrative towards being more inclusive to like men, whereas men are very much also harmed by issues of gender, for example, like toxic masculinity and so on, and that like by creating this narrative that the feminist movement is also there for them, we would like more easily solve gender inequality, for example.
Okay, so this is a big question as well, right? Entire like debate circle that argument, and you're able to find good arguments for and against it. I think that the association of certain stereotypes with the gender is harmful to both men and women. So for example, the idea of toxic masculinity and not being able to let out your feelings, etc., I think that is harmful. In my personal opinion, everybody would benefit from a world in which that is not the case, right? And you stand on a ground of equal gender opportunities and equality, and then you can make individual decisions. So a woman can decide to be a stay-at-home mom and wife, but it's out of a position of power, not out of a position of need. And a man can let out his feelings and cry. I personally think everybody would benefit from it, but I guess it is kind of tied to your understanding of power, because as I mentioned earlier, if you view power in a zero-sum term, you would kind of assume that men have to give up some of their privilege, some of their power in order for there to be gender equality, and then maybe it would be a little bit of a disadvantage to men as well, right? But the way I view it is that women can do a lot by revolting and by standing up for their rights, but it certainly would not be harmful if more men that or that in the status quo hold a majority of the dominant positions maybe in companies, if they would speak out for the feminist cause and help them advance the movement as well, right? So I do not think that would be harmful at all, and in my opinion everybody would like benefit from a gender equal society. However, I also noticed, maybe this is going a little bit further than your question, but I also noticed that me in my, studying at a university, being in a pretty liberal circle of friends, for me, it's kind of intuitive, right? So everybody needs feminism, in my opinion, and everybody would be better off with feminism. But then if I break that bubble, sometimes and meet new people or go like on social media or something, there's some points of confrontation where I step out of the bubble and I realize that there are a lot of people that do not view it the same way at all, that there are women that do not feel that there is a need for feminism, etc. So yeah, in my opinion, everybody would benefit from more feminism and more gender equality, men and women, but that's coming from a very liberal standpoint as well. There was another question in the chat. Wait. Do you believe that if it is in the feminist movement's interest to get equality, that it is in the feminist movement's interest for women to be conscripted as well as men? Or do you believe that the feminist movement doesn't want this because conscription isn't a good thing, so they don't want bad things for women? Okay, so conscription is like another topic, right? In my personal opinion, I am for a world without like weapons at all and stuff. I don't think that the world would be a worse place if there was no military at all. But then there are entire articles dealing with whether conscription is better because it does not advantage the elite, and otherwise maybe only poor people out of a need, or out of need, or because they are poor would conscribe to the military. Right now, we can witness that more women, based on their own free choice, conscribe to the military, which is kind of what I mentioned earlier with like the US example with more women joining the military, right? I think that conscription should, like, and military in general should not be a thing, because it is harmful. But I guess how you would answer it is that you would say that, like, if you would have conscription as the world is right now in the status quo, there is no full gender equality reached yet, right? So that would be an additional obstacle women would have to deal with, based on, for example, the like shower room situation, where the structures are mainly oriented for men and are not set out to be encompassing for men quite yet, I guess. But there are a lot of like scholarly texts that deal with the issue specifically. So how it is the best way to get soldiers for a military, whether it is conscription, whether it is lottery, etc. So that deal with it in a philosophical kind of way. And I guess gendering it would be very interesting as well. In my opinion, like in my little utopia, we wouldn't have military at all. I don't think armies are a good thing, but the answer to your question, I think, is saying that there are so many disadvantages and obstacles women deal with based on their gender, probably would not be fair to conscribe them additionally as well. And you could like use principled argumentation saying that war often disproportionately harms women, right? Based on what I told you a little bit earlier. And so it could be unjust, etc. Okay. Another question, do you think that feminism in specifically third world countries should be tied with religion culture? Because I personally believe that feminism shouldn't be tied with a specific religion, as it limits the amount of people that can identify themselves with the movement. Can you maybe explain real quick what you mean with it being tied to a religion?
I'll just unmute myself. So in specific, we had a motion during summer debating specifically that in certain countries, specifically in African countries, feminism is extremely tied to religion, or specifically tied to a different culture, meaning that, for example, they were talking about how feminism is in India, it's extremely tied to their religion. So to I'm not sure like how exactly, but it was extremely tied to a certain religion, meaning only women from that religion were identifying with this specific leader who was spreading out feminism among that specific religion, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm hoping this makes it a bit
No,
clearer.
no, I get it. Okay, so you're saying that like feminism in certain cultures or is tied to like a specific understanding of culture, religion, and yeah, those type of things, right? So I think what would maybe help is to like ask the question like which women you are talking about, and how you would characterize that specific group of women, because if it is a group of women that based on their religion maybe does not have so many ties to Western culture, Western feminism, and those kind of liberation movements, kind of the trade-off could be having that feminism based on religion compared to having no feminism at all. But if you ask on a more like general level, right, whether feminism at all should be tied to religion or culture, I personally think that feminism is needed in all of the cultures and all of the religions still, since no country has achieved true gender equality yet based on also UN findings. So I think the trade-off is what would be the alternative, and if you're talking about a specific group of women or about women in general. Okay, was that kind of an answer? Yes. There was another question in the chat. A lot of times when women call themselves feminists, they're ridiculed, therefore many women are told to be humanist. How would you challenge that? Or how would we challenge that? Okay, so yeah, that's a big issue in my personal opinion as well. So a lot of times when people say that they are feminists, it is kind of associated with the insanely radical bra burning, not shaving their legs, I don't know, hating all men kind of women or kind of feminism, which is not the feminism we're talking about, right? We're talking about the intersectional and equalitarian feminist movement. So sometimes people like being humanist, that kind of involves the idea of gender equality, right, as such, so that also has the ideal of the genders being equal. I think if you would say you're like fighting for a feminist cause, the ideal would be trying to associate it with a positive thing. So associate feminism with yeah, reaching gender equality as well, because then what is done in the name of feminism is acknowledged as such. But if you are talking to other individuals that like stop listening once you say feminism, because I feel like the term has been used so much, it comes up in so many different areas, people just like switch off their brain when they hear feminism, and then it just might make sense to avoid the terminology and talk about gender equality, because in the end the outcome is the same, right? Okay, any other questions? I don't think so. Okay, great. So then I think we're done for today. Thank you so much for tuning into this virtual meeting. I hope it was somewhat helpful for your debate future. yeah, if there are no more questions, then I hope you have a lovely evening. Thank you for listening. And yeah, I wish you all the best for your debate and feminist future. Goodbye.
Bye.
Okay.
Hey, fertig.
Du auch, alles klar. Cool. Du musst noch deine Aufnahme beenden, Sarah.
Wie? Ah, hier.
Einfach derselbe